Hello and welcome to Everybody's a Story with Jeff Seltzer. I am your host, Jeff Seltzer. Thank you once again for joining us in this journey as we try to learn about everybody's stories, and maybe I share a few of my own. As always, I want to remind everybody you can find the podcast on Instagram at Everybody is a Story Pod. My personal Instagram is at Seltzer77. For all things Jeff Seltzer, you can always check me out at Jeff Seltzer, at jeffseltzer.com. We're still there, haven't moved yet. From a YouTube perspective, you can check us out at Everybody is a Story Pod on YouTube. Reminder that we are on all podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, iHeartRadio, all the good stuff. Really excited to be on here as I always am. Last week got a lot of really great comments about the bonus pod. So as you guys know, what I mentioned last week, I had a podcast, it was a solo pod early in the week, which I think went pretty well. Probably shared a little bit too much, but that's how life goes sometimes. And I mentioned at the end of that podcast, I was going to go see a movie, Novocaine. Maybe I'd throw out a bonus pod. And then what do you know, on Wednesday, I threw out a bonus pod. So that happened. That was pretty cool. 5-minute podcast per Marcus Brandon. That was the second shortest podcast I put out so far. Promised him I'd try to go longer than that every week. I think at this point, we're about 20% of the way to that bonus pod timeline. So we'll see how it goes. Really fun. I've seen a few more movies in the next week or two. Probably going to go see Snow White. What else I can see? I'll find something, and I'm sure I'll probably drop a few reviews or comments about that as well. Before introducing my guest for the week, I did want to talk about something that I thought about quite a bit. So as many of you probably know, I'm a huge fan of pop music. Obviously, as a 47-year-old guy, it's not necessarily what most people listen to. But for me, I've always kind of owned my music, and I don't really care. I mean, years ago in college, I worked in a Sam Goody. Was all about rap music, pop music, rock music, 70s, classic, whatever it is. It really didn't matter to me. What to see in sync back in like 2000, 2001. It was like me. It was like 99% females about my age, and me, and obviously a few males, I guess, whatever else like that. Really awesome. Had a lot of fun back then. And then years later, obviously Justin Timberlake blew up, and I saw him again. It was last fall with my daughter. We went to a show at the Prudential Center, which was a lot of fun. Fast forward, 24, 25 years at this point. Took my older daughter to go see Blackpink about 2 years ago. Amazing. K-pop, really great. Lots of fun. So energetic. And then fast forward like a year or so from there, and they're pretty much all doing stuff from a solo perspective, which is crazy. Lisa had a couple of songs that were really good. And now she's in this season's White Lotus, I think it is. So she's really good in that. This morning, for the first time on TikTok, I heard Jenny, who's from Blackpink as well. She dropped a song. I think it's called It's Jenny or Like Jenny, I think it's called. Super catchy. Really love it. So for me, I mean, it's a bop. Love it. Definitely, banging my head to it and such like that. And it's just something I can listen to and have fun with it. So anybody else out there into pop music, let me know. Shoot me a comment on Instagram at Everybody's a Story Pod or at Seltzer77. Let me know what you think. Additionally, obviously having 2 teenage daughters, that only helps to, feed my love of pop music. Over the last couple of years, I've gone to a bunch of bands, a bunch of shows. Saw Lady Gaga, which was amazing. Took my younger one to see Billie Eilish about 2-3 years ago. So much fun. Last year, my older daughter and my wife went to Toronto to see Taylor Swift, which I was super jealous about. It was amazing what I heard. Tried to go see Gracie Abrams this year. Tickets sold out too quickly. But we did get tickets for Sabrina Carpenter. So really excited to see Sabrina in October at Madison Square Garden. Show sold out really quickly. Tickets were a little pricey, but the 4 of us are going. Should be a lot of fun and lots of cool stuff to see there. With that said, and speaking of awesome things, here is my guest for the week, Tina Tonielli. Tina, it's great to see you. How are you today?
Hey, Jeff. I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So for those of you that don't know, Tina and I do work together. Although weirdly, in talking to my wife, she might have met you about 15, 20 years ago working at another company. So it seems like it really is a small world in the industry that we're working, isn't it?
For sure. And I think I've worked at 2 companies my whole life, but there's a lot of people who've come in and out of those companies.
Yeah.
So my contact list is extremely diverse.
It's super
even
funny.
Though I've only been at 2 companies.
It's super funny because so you've only had 2 companies. For me, I have the kind of the opposite career timeline. So I've worked at, I think, 7 or 8 companies since college.
Wow. Yeah.
But I often play the, do you know Jeff Seltzer or do you know Beth Seltzer game? So basically, I think between my wife and I, we've kind of established that basically everyone in the industry either knows or has worked with either me or her. Like when I started off at Pfizer, there were a number of people who were like, hey, do you know Beth Seltzer? I'm like, yep, that's my wife, like stuff like that. So it's just crazy. I mean, it just shows in, let's say, central North Jersey, you really can't burn any bridges, because if so, you can definitely blackball yourself from a job,
For sure. It sounds like 7 degrees of Jeff Seltzer. We've got that going on. Or it's 7 degrees of Jeff and Beth Seltzer.
It pretty much is. I mean, this is where, and I've made this joke before on the podcast as well. When I first named the podcast, Everybody's a Story with Jeff Seltzer, my older daughter Robin was like, does that mean everybody literally has a story with Jeff Seltzer? Or is everybody sharing their story with Jeff Seltzer? And I was like, you know what? Punctuation matters. I probably should have thought about that before the branding and the naming. But I mean, at this point, we're 35 episodes in, and here we are, right?
I think it's great.
Awesome. Well, for those of you that are lost or don't know what I'm talking about or who I'm talking to, Tina, would you mind giving a little background on who Tina Tonielli is?
Sure. So I am a business executive. I've worked in 2 companies, as I mentioned before, for multiple decades. I hit 50 last year, so that was kind of a big milestone for me.
Happy birthday, by the way. Happy belated.
Yeah, it's been very enlightening, let's just say, but in a really amazingly good way. I'm loving being 50. It's awesome. So I worked at 2 companies. I worked at one company for 20 years, and then I came in, I worked at another company, and I've been there now for almost 9 years. And it's been 3 different companies at the same time. So it's an interesting experience. Let's just say the last 9 years have been really different than the 20 before that in terms of the company and how it's changed. I started in marketing, and I've always joked that I'm a marketer at heart, but I've also spent the majority of my career learning about people. And so I am fascinated and super curious about people and what makes people tick. I think that's what attracted me to marketing. And so then the opportunity to spend 100% of my time just understanding people and what makes them tick and diving into businesses and understand what makes them tick, that's kind of my jam.
Of course.
And then since then, I would say, as I've progressed in my career, it's been more about understanding my teams and how they tick.
Right.
Because what I've seen is as you get promoted and as you move in your career, that stuff that I loved the most, like getting into those crosstabs and like having tough conversations with the agency about creative briefs and things, they kind of went by the wayside. Right. And you couldn't do the things that you loved as much anymore. So I had new things. So for me, the new things that I love is influencing organizations and really helping people to get their potential, identify their full potential. So it's sort of like that's unlocking the potential of people, I would say, is kind of a big purpose for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. And it's interesting too, because like I think our careers do contrast a little bit, right? So you said you worked for 2 companies. I've worked for like 7 or 8. Obviously, you working for 2 companies. You're, the company that pays you might have changed a few times as mergers, acquisitions. These things just happen. I mean, just the way that it goes, right? Like years ago, Pfizer was really into consumer healthcare. Then decided they don't want it, sold to J&J. Then they wanted to get back in, bought Wyeth, and they sold again because they want to get out. It's just the way that it's cyclical. It's the way that it goes.
Yep.
Additionally, what I'll say too is I know you've largely gone in marketing, and you're obviously in a different role right now as well. Like for me, I've probably had 15 different types of roles. So for me, I've always been along the lines of like I don't like to get bored in a role. So for me, if I'm in a role for let's say 2 to 3 years, I start to get bored and I stop learning and developing. So in my career, I've worked in market research, analytics, customer analytics. I've worked in sales. I've worked in marketing, sales operations, customer strategy, trade promotions, supply chain. For me, it's largely a case of if I'm in a role and someone's like, hey, you want to try X? I'm like, absolutely, let's try X. Like for me, I don't even think about like how it is or if I want to do it. And I'm like, you know what? It's an opportunity. It's something I can add to it. Something different I can pick up and add to my tool belt of sorts. Largely, I'd say to the point where now at this point, 26 years into my career, I like it because now no matter who I work with or deal with, I know what they're thinking, or I kind of know their perspective.
You've been in their shoes, or
right.
You understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely. So like when I work with like finance, I'm like, okay, I know how they think and how to kind of motivate them. Or when I work with marketing or sales, like I understand their KPIs or their drive or kind of how to influence. Obviously, not everyone's as influenced or knowledgeable, or not everybody's in the same mindset. But for me, it definitely helps to at least say, okay, if I was a marketer, what would I want out of this? And it definitely helps the conversation. It gives a little credibility sometimes too. When I'm like, hey, you guys should consider this. It's not some outsider. It's someone who's actually done it before, which definitely helps.
Yeah, I found the same thing. So I moved from marketing into marketing research. And at the time, marketing research was much more focused on methodology and sort of the development of studies and the execution of studies. And when I came in, having come from marketing, I had a different perspective. And my perspective was, how do we help these people grow their businesses? And so for me, having that I have an insatiable curiosity to learn about people. And I would learn about my stakeholders and I would learn about my consumers. And I would sort of pull those pieces together and bring in my experience and help people grow their business. And I always say to my team, I'm like, if you're in an enabling function, if you're like a cost center, you have to be driving business impact and you have to be growing businesses, or
Right.
people don't. That's how you get a seat at the table, ultimately, and people in enabling functions tend to complain about not having seats at the table. And I'm like, you just got to make it happen. And you make it happen by, delivering growth. So anyway, it's been a great experience. And I get where you're coming from in terms of that empathizing with your stakeholders, because I found that to be incredibly enlightening and helpful for me as I've gone through my career, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great mindset. And I've been I'm probably guilty of it myself, but I've worked with a number of people years ago who basically they're like, okay, I do X and Y and that's what I do. Not necessarily understanding the context of where it fits into everything. Like, hey, if I don't do this properly, other things don't happen. The butterfly effect hits.
Yeah.
Right. So making sure that everyone understands, like, hey, you have a purpose. If you work for this company, there's a reason why you're employed. Right. Like this feeds into that, which feeds into that. And so when other groups are waiting for things, that's obviously either lost time or lost efficiency or lost money, whatever it is. So like making sure that everyone understands their importance to the company and why it drives them.
Well, and I think to build on that, for me, Jeff, what's interesting is the sort of, I do what I do and I just do what is in my sort of wheelhouse and area versus I've been really in love with the idea of a growth mindset over the last couple of years. That's become like a really big, and I have 2 teenage daughters also. So I feel you on that one. And I know exactly who Blackpink is. So
very nice.
Anyway, it's just the idea of a growth mindset to me, even if you don't move from your job. So I haven't moved from my role technically for a number of years, but every single year has been wildly different. Jeff. So like 1 year I'm like, oh, I'm going to teach everybody about foresight. Next year I'm like, I'm going to teach everybody about this. And then the next year I'm going to do something generative AI. So it's if you have that mindset of growth mindset and curiosity and learning, I think you can always grow in your current role. And that's one of my soapbox things that I get on to people is like, stop trying to get promoted. Like, I get it. Like, that's good, but don't go for roles, go for fulfillment, go for what makes you happy, and where you have energy.
I totally get that. I mean, for me, and again, obviously everybody's different and what motivates them, right? Early in the career, it's like, hey, how do I make as much money as possible, right? When you're making $32,000 a year out of college and you can barely make your rent, your first thought is, okay, how do I get promoted so I can get more money?
Yeah.
Eventually, hopefully get to a spot where you're making, more than you ever expected you would, and you're in a good spot. And, I'd say personally, I'm at a spot now where I'm like, okay, I think I'm finally fairly compensated. Don't tell my boss that. And then you're kind of looking at like, okay, so if money's not the variable I'm looking to drive for or grow, which obviously we always want more money, what is it that makes me happy? Like what gets me up in the morning and what helps me to kind of push through and enjoy it, and not just enjoy it myself, but like make those around me better, right? In terms of mentoring and in terms of teaching and coaching and stuff like that. So something different gets everyone else going. It's a matter of being realistic and honest with yourself and saying like, hey, this is what I want. This is what I'm looking for. To your point from before, don't necessarily look to get promoted, but for some people, if that's their drive, that's what they should be going for. But being realistic absolutely. That, if at the end of the day, you're looking at it and you're like, I don't want to be VP or CEO because I don't want to work 90 hours a week or whatever it is, right? Just being realistic that like, hey, I could do something, but I have to sacrifice something else. So just being realistic that, you want to get to where you want to get to and you're not getting there for fantasy reasons. Because once you're there, and if you're not happy, you're kind of screwed.
Well, and I think to your point, the way I like to think about it is it's not about going for a title or a role. It's about what that opens up for you.
Yes.
So to your point on like when you're living paycheck to paycheck, you want to not live paycheck to paycheck anymore. Right. So the kind of role that you look for, you want to say, hey, I need to be making more money than I'm making now. And I've been in that kind of situation in the past, right? But then I think the other piece, if you can, as early as possible, Jeff, go, hey, I don't want to, somebody said once, don't run from something, run to something. And I think it's just so powerful, because so often either we're running to money or we're running to a title, and you don't think about, I have to go do that job now. Like, what is it like to actually do that job all day, every day? And do I like what the things are, who the people are that I'm going to work with, what the culture is that I'm going to work in? Like, people don't think about those things when they're being so solar and laser focused on promotions. Because they could leave a company to go get promoted and go to a company where they don't fit in the culture and people don't respect them. And then it's like, wow, that was not the best move, but at least you got your title that you were looking for.
Of course.
So to me, it's just about the broader consideration set of what makes you happy at work.
Yeah, it's funny, and we'll get to the actual topic of the show in a second, but it makes me think about a quote that I heard years ago. So about 20 years ago, I was working for a company called Nielsen, and we had a president of our region who used to say, you wanted the job, you got the job, now do the job. Right? So it's a case of, if this is what you're going after and you actually get the spot, okay, great, we've hired you, now go do what you wanted to do, right? And be careful of what you wish for, because you might get it, basically. So just be mindful and just be thoughtful of, hey, this is what I'm going for. Okay, I've landed there. Now I actually have to do the job. So just, be aware it's going to happen at some point,
Yeah, no, it's so true. And there was one that somebody told me recently, which I thought was really also insightful, which was like, go for the job as you can make it. So it's almost like, is there an opportunity for you to change the job or make the job into something more? So like when I came into research, it was more about executing reports and delivering reports. And I saw the potential of it to be something else. So I went in and I influenced that change for it to be something else. So I think as you probably progress more in your career, you see those opportunities, but people sometimes feel stuck and look at a role and say, oh, that's not interesting to me. Could you make it interesting? Like, what could you do to the role to make it more interesting?
Absolutely. So with that said, the topic for the show, as you probably see in the show notes right now, is something that Tina does post a lot about on LinkedIn called Project Badass. So I've seen it for, I think, weeks or months at this point. It's always intrigued me. And then Tina and I talked a little bit about it at work when we ran into each other at the coffee area not long ago. I don't drink coffee, but we were in that area regardless.
I drink coffee, Jeff.
You drink enough for both of us, I'm sure. So.
Probably.
I'm more of a Dr. Pepper Mountain Dew guy. But,
yeah. Well, I am also a Coke Zero kind of person. People will tell, it's the morning, I'm a coffee, then I Coke Zero, and then at some point around 3:00, I got to do that another coffee run. But
Absolutely. Yeah. So with that said, Project Badass, and as I mentioned to Tina before the show, we try not to curse in the show. We haven't yet, except for Tarzan back at the wrestling show. So that's about as close as we're going to get to cursing. I think, and I looked it up ahead of time, badass isn't technically a curse in 2025. I think 30 years ago it probably would have been. But I think things have kind of loosened up a little bit over the years. So this is where we are. With that said, Tina, how do you define, or what is Project Badass?
So Project Badass is about unleashing your inner badass. And I think that for me, when I hit 50, and I just really took a look inside myself and thought about, am I truly happy? What am I, am I doing the things that give me fulfillment? I think a lot of times, especially women in our culture, have a tendency to focus so much on everybody else. And it's like, if they're happy, I'm happy. But are you really happy? And when you think about that and go, I'm actually thinking about it in my body and feeling it in your body and saying, am I truly happy? And if you realize that you're not, which quite frankly, I wasn't, I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't been happy for it. And I think a lot of women, especially moms, have that moment of reflection of I haven't actually been happy for a long time, because I've spent so much of my time and energy making sure everybody around me is happy, that taking a minute and just sort of reflecting and then saying, well, what am I going to do about it? Right. So to me, it was that moment of reflection to say, I'm actually not happy. Oh my goodness. And then what am I going to go do about it? Because I am an optimist and a creative sort of I'm proactive in that kind of way. So I couldn't not do something. So I was like, hey, what am I going to do? And what I just started doing, I read some books that were amazing. There's one that's about buy yourself the, I won't say word, lilies. But I read that book. It was life-changing for me. So the idea of thinking about, are you happy or not? And if you're not happy, how do you get yourself to a place where you are happy? And again, especially moms don't take the time to think about themselves and think about what makes them happy and where joy comes from for them. And that, to me, honestly, badass is all about like just being yourself, like knowing who you are and being who you are and getting what you want in a way that I think can still live within the confines of our culture. And what I tend to see is this idea of badass is like someone who is assertive about what they want. They know who they are, and they're out there sort of making things better for other people. And people give them that permission. A lot of times women, when we're super assertive, there are words that people associate with us that are not badass.
Right.
And I think for me, it's about how do you get that assertive and that idea of sort of making things work for yourself in a way that sort of attracts people to you instead of like pushes people away from you.
Awesome. So you shared a lot there, Tina. So let me see if we can dig into it a little bit.
Let's unpack there.
Let's unpack there, as we would say. Let's double click into that a little bit. Whatever other jargon I can find from corporate America.
All good.
Of course. So like you said, you basically hit a point in life where you're like, hey, what can I do to kind of like, I don't know, like maybe be happier, right? Or kind of be more myself, more my authentic self. You read a little bit more, you learn more about it. Myself personally, I would say in the last like 5 or 6 years, I went to therapy. I did all sorts of things to kind of get a sense of like, hey, you know, there were certain aspects of my life I wasn't happy with. Like, how do I, you know, become, you know, come to peace with it, but at the same time, you know, not repeat some of the things that have happened in the past. How do I kind of, you know, improve upon it, and how do I not repeat the cycle, right? Let's say, without getting too deep into it. So obviously, as you had said, you learned a little bit about it. You figured out like what works, what doesn't work. So from a personal perspective, like, were there things that you changed? Like, I know you said you became like more assertive. Are there things that you would say, like, just making this up, like family dinner was always, I don't know, your kids or your spouse's choice? Do you finally say, hey, let's go to Olive Garden because I haven't done Olive Garden in a while and I want to do Olive Garden? Like, was that kind of the thing? Or was it something like, hey, we never go to Disney World, let's go to Disney World? Like what kind of like was your outcome from this?
So for me, my husband and I have very different interests. Okay. So he very much is a keeping busy hobbies. He's a stay-at-home dad, but he's the busiest stay-at-home dad I've ever seen because he is just constantly busy and constantly running and constantly doing things.
Sure.
And so before we had kids, we were doing all that stuff together. And then after we had kids, then we were trying to find things to do as a family. And one thing that I'll give you as an example of me changing my mindset was skiing. And we would drive 7 hours every single weekend to go to Vermont to go skiing. Right. And I enjoyed it. I did. I love Vermont's a really special kind of place. And the place where we were skiing was really special. And having the kids have the opportunity to learn to ski when they're 2 and 3 years old is also just an amazing gift I wanted to give my kids. I didn't have that as a child. So I was wanting to do that for them, create memories as a family. So I was very focused on creating memories as a family.
Of course.
And then I also have a very long drive to work. And so I was driving to work. I was driving home. I was getting in the car. I was going 7 hours. I was coming back. And then I was coming back to work like the next week.
Right.
And for me, honestly, I think it was COVID that started me saying to myself, like, what in the heck are you doing? And so it sort of continued that. And people will say that to me all the time, like, you're crazy. What are you doing? And I just kind of like laughed it off for a long time. And then I think for me, as I did this reflection and said, how much do I love skiing? And I was like, I did, but now my family is so much better and faster than I am. Every single one of them, that when we go skiing, they're off doing their thing and I'm skiing by myself, or God forbid if I ski with them and they have to wait for slow mommy, which is just, I do not, 0 stars on that approach. I don't recommend it. That's not fun for me.
Right.
So I actually said to my husband, I was like, I'm not going to go to Vermont. I'm not going to go to Vermont as often as we go. We have a place there. So I have gone there.
Sure.
But we went every single weekend. And I was like, I'm just not going to go. I'm just going to stay home I'm gonna, and one of my daughters stayed home with me a decent amount this year, and my other two kids went up with my husband, and like that was a big deal for me to just be like, no, really, you just go, and I'm just gonna stay, and that's really okay. Because the prior me would have been like, oh my God, you can't spend your weekend, away from your husband. You're gonna make him go by himself, and
right.
I'm just like, no, it's actually okay. That's okay.
So it's great that it sounds like from the evolution of Tina, you felt empowered to kind of say, you know what, even though, let's say I'm older, 40s, whatever else like that, like I feel comfortable enough in my skin to say, you know what, we've always done this, but I want to change the routine, do something different. And obviously change is difficult. Change is hard for different people at different stages in life. What was the initial feedback, let's say, from those around you, right? Because like if one day I wake up and say, okay, I want to do something very different, like good or bad, I'm going to get some weird looks from my kids or my wife. It's not going to be like, it's like, is that okay? Like, what's going on? Like, was your husband, your kids are like, okay, cool, whatever? Or were they kind of like, hey, what's going on with mom? Is she okay? This is different for us,
So there's more information. I'm not going to get into like the whole deal here. But what I will tell you is that it was part of an overall transformational time for us as a family, where I kind of put my foot down and said, I need to start doing things for me. I need to start doing things that are different than what the family does for me, or different than what my husband does for me.
Sure.
Because I have finally realized that I'm actually not happy. And I had been acting like I was happy. Like everybody thought I was happy. And then it's like, no, actually I haven't been happy. And that was traumatic for us as a family unit to have to go through that. So it was very difficult to go through that. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
But when we got on the other side of it, therapy for both of us has been amazing to really get to that. I feel like I know that I'm not happy when I'm not happy. Whereas before, it wasn't even a matter of me doing things that didn't make me happy. I just didn't know. Like I literally would be like, I'm happy because everybody's happy around me. This is what happy feels like. And then I was like, this is not what happy feels like.
Yeah, totally. And I was going to say, I totally get it. I mean, for me, historically, I've always been a people pleaser. I often times tell people now I'm a recovering people pleaser.
Yes, ditto. Right back.
Comes from my upbringing. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but it's a case of like over the years for me, my emotional happiness was tied to everybody else around me. Yeah. In the case of like for me, my goal was basically to make sure everyone around me was good, and if they weren't happy, I wasn't happy, which is a very unhealthy situation to be.
100. I feel you 100% on that one, Jeff. Right there.
Because there were so many variables that like some people that may or may not be in my life at this point, that no matter what you do aren't going to be happy. And if my happiness is tied to their happiness, basically it's not going to happen. Right. So eventually over time, again, therapy, other, self-therapy, reading, stuff like that, kind of figure out like, okay, how do I get beyond this? And how do I kind of figure out a way to make myself happy? And if they are or not, I mean, obviously try my best, but at the end of the day, don't tie everyone's happiness together because it's just an unrealistic end game,
Totally. And I've been with my husband since we were both 18 years old. Like we're 50. So
you're not the same people anymore.
We're not the same people. Right. And we've been through a lot. Like we had kids, we've had hobbies. Like there's so many things that have happened. And when you're in that kind of situation for so long, I think we also have a tendency as people to sort of triage our way through life of like, you just look at the thing that's right in front of you of like, well, I have to go to work today, or I have to get the kids to, basketball practice, or I have to, and so you have to, or you should kind of your way through your life. And for me, I was 100% guilty of that. Just like, make sure everybody's happy. Like, what are we doing this weekend to make everybody happy? And then I was like, wait a minute. I actually deserve happiness too. And the other thing that I think I learned was this idea of sort of, you are your own soulmate. You are your own best friend.
Absolutely.
And being with someone since I was 18, it definitely like we became one person a lot of times. Yeah. And so to be able to say, no, I don't like this, and I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet. I had to really get connected to myself and listen to myself and go, wow, you're really mean to yourself a lot of times. You talk major smack to yourself. So you need to start thinking about, you talk to other people. So like, I'm such a hype woman. Like my friends all know I am like cheering everybody around and telling them they can do it and encouraging people, giving them positive support. And I was talking major smack to myself. And I was like, let me just try one time when I'm like riding a bike or something, just to say to myself, like, you got this, girl, like you can make this happen. And I did. And I was like, holy crap, I feel so much better. It's like stupid, but it really actually makes a meaningful difference when you catch yourself and just make that change and that shift. It is transformational in terms of like happiness and being able to do things.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, for me, I'll say this, like similar to you, I'm also very much like, you know, the hype guy around, you know, trying to prop everybody up, help them out, stuff like that. But again, as a recovering people pleaser, it's just going to happen, right? It's just by default who we are. I will say that I am my own worst critic as well. I mean, for the most part, I think that's how it is. While everybody or a lot of people, you know, can hype themselves up, I have trouble with that because I tend to move the goalpost for myself. Like, I think a lot of it is like I set a goal for myself. And when I hit that goal, I'm like, yeah, but I didn't do this. And I'm like, I have to take a step back and be realistic about it and say, right, but I didn't aim for that. Like if I aim for X and I just get X, that should be great because that's what my goal is. I mean, part of me also says that's probably how corporate America works too, in the fact that meets expectation is considered not a good review.
Yes,
which is very weird because you look at it, you're like, no, you gave me these KPIs. I hit these KPIs. Where's the issue? If you want me to do more, it's like, have you ever seen the movie Office Space before?
Yes, 100%. Right. Yes.
So there's a scene in the restaurant, kind of like Bennigan's is a bad example because it doesn't exist anymore. I think it was Flingers where they worked at Jennifer Aniston, and they all had to wear flares. They all had to wear
flare. That's
shirts.
What it was.
And they had to wear at least like 19 pieces of flair or something like that.
Yep.
So Jennifer Aniston wore 19 pieces of flair, and someone else wore like 34 pieces. The manager walks over and is like, "Why do you only have 19 pieces of flair?" And she's like, "Well, that was the goal."
Yeah.
She's like, "Should I wear more flair?" He goes, "Well, only if you want to." But he's giving her like a hard time. It's like, okay, well, tell me what the goal is and I'll hit the goal. It's one of those things where it's kind of like, if this is not the goal, give me a better goal and I'll hit that goal. It's just really weird, you know?
No, totally. And it's funny because there's work Tina and home Tina.
Sure.
And like work Tina is like a beast on like setting goals and beating them and all that stuff. And home Tina was like, I'm so freaking tired from everything that I'm just going to try to make everybody happy around me and take a nap. Like that was like home Tina. And, you know, it's like, what are your hobbies? Like, I don't have time for hobbies, but then it's like, that's bull crap.
Nonsense. Yes.
There we go, Jeff. You actually have time, but you have to understand what gives you joy first. Right. Like what makes you happy, what gives you joy. And the goals should come off of that. I am also guilty, Jeff, of setting completely unrealistic goals and missing them and calling myself a failure. And then quitting.
Oh, no.
And I had a really great therapy session once where my therapist was like, like I didn't want to post on LinkedIn. I was really nervous about posting on LinkedIn. I didn't want people to like laugh at me or something. And it was like, I want it to be perfect. It has to be perfect to be able to be put on LinkedIn. And she was like, Tina, like, do you hear yourself? Like, if you're not perfect, what does that mean? And I was like, if I'm not, that's a failure. And then it's like, do you realize how screwed up that is that you're sitting there saying, and it's the same thing you were saying too, Jeff, of like, if you don't exceed your goals, you're underperforming.
Absolutely.
Like, we give ourselves these things and then it's like we don't realize how we're holding ourselves back, I guess, is where this ultimately badass came from. Was me going, wow, I've been not happy and not realizing it, holding myself back, apologizing. One of my favorite posts was one I did about apologizing. When people bump into you and you apologize to them for them bumping into you, it's just insane. So I think badass is about like what makes you happy. Go out there and make it happen and do it in a way that people are actually not going to hate you. Like I think we all think if we do people pleasing, recovering also. Guilty,
yes.
If I don't please the people, everybody's going to hate me. No, they won't.
Right. So a couple of things you said there. So first of all, I often say at work, let's not let perfection get in the way of good enough.
Yes.
Right? Like especially working in corporate America, there were so many variables we can't control and so many things that we just can't get at that I try to remind myself, like, look, it doesn't have to be perfect. If the expectation is something, show them something, show some progress, get there. We'll get to perfection eventually, but at least show that we're on the way, which I think is number one. Number two, something else that you said was about work Tina and home Tina. It took me a number of years to kind of again, as I've said a lot in the podcast before, like I have a lot of quirky interests and a lot of weird, let's say, personality traits and such like that to me. So for me, I spent a number of years with like work Jeff and like home Jeff. And that gets very like schizophrenic in the fact that it's very tough, right? It's tough after a while to kind of like be two different people, because for the most part, your authentic self is going to be your home self, right?
Yeah.
Like your work self is going to be like this professional corporate Jeff, and this is what I have to do, and this is how I have to talk. Eventually, like it took around like 10 or 15 years, they kind of morphed into like who Jeff is. I got more comfortable in my own skin, more authentic. I even like through that, like made friends at work who have similar interests, right? So my buddy who's been on the pod multiple times, Daniel Ireland, huge wrestling fan as well. We go to wrestling shows all the time, and we basically bonded over the fact that we both spend way too much money and go to wrestling events. So it's just something cool that, like, if it wasn't for me kind of like, sharing who I am at work, Daniel and I probably never would have bonded, and I wouldn't be having some of the amazing experiences at wrestling shows that I do with him. So it's like little things like that,
No, I think that for me, it's going to sound weird, but I was actually more my authentic self at work than I was at home.
Interesting.
And so it was like I was laughing and interacting with people and everything. And then when I got home, I was making myself a lot smaller to try to fit into these boxes that I thought I needed to fit into.
Right.
And so I was getting energy at work, and I was less energized at home. Now, don't get me wrong. My kids are amazing. I love my kids. Like, they're great.
Right.
But parenting them and the stress of trying to make sure that they're safe, they're happy, they're fulfilled, it's exhausting. And there's no room. Like, I was making no room for me. Right. Because I was constantly like worrying about everybody else. And that's when, for me, I was like, wow, you have people pleased so much out of work. Right. And people at work are like, you're a badass, Tina. Like, you never hold yourself back. And I'm like, home Tina is like, trying to like not, so it was me. It was actually in some ways the opposite. And then I think the home Tina that I've become now is influencing the work Tina also, because I'm probably more authentic at work because I'm more joyful at home now.
Got it. Well, that's helpful. I mean, at the end of the day, we spend so much time with our families. We spend so much time at work. One side definitely can impact how we feel and how we act around the other. Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Do you consider yourself, and again, I know because we're obviously a little different, work versus home. Do you consider yourself more an introvert, an extrovert, or a hybrid? Like, what would you refer to yourself as?
I am absolutely a hybrid.
Okay.
It's funny. I was asking someone, are they an introverted extrovert or are they an extroverted introvert? And I'm like, I think I'm an introverted extrovert, because my natural inclination when I'm around people, or I'm very comfortable actually getting up on a stage and talking to large groups of people.
Sure.
I'm way less comfortable talking one-on-one to people. You put me in like a cocktail hour and I am in like full on panic mode.
Yeah.
So like that social anxiety, I think, is worrisome for me. So then I just want to go be by myself. So like if I could get off the stage and just go like sit by myself and read a book and watch TikTok, then I would be really happy. So I'm very gregarious and outgoing at work, and I'm very much like a homebody at home.
So I'm happy you said you're a hybrid, because for me, here's the thing. So I spent years referring to myself as an introvert. And I know people say, well, would an introvert really start a podcast and kind of talk out publicly? It's a very weird thing to say, right?
Yeah.
Or even like I remember years ago at work at one point, I was yelling at somebody because I'm an introvert. But like, would an introvert really yell that out, right?
Yeah.
I think what I figured out, and I think what I figured out over the years, is that I am largely an introvert. Like, I know you had said, like, you might get drained from like a meeting or whatever else that. Like for me, like we work with a lot of, let's say, salespeople who like live off of being around lots of people. It's really get that energy, right? I went to our sales meeting a few weeks ago, and like every night I would go home exhausted. Like for me, being around that many people, like for me, like it drains me. Like for me, I'm putting all this energy out. Like I'm not getting energy back. I think, and I call myself a hybrid because I think I've evolved a bit over the years, because I recognize in corporate America, at least years ago, introverts didn't get that far. Like they were looked at as like timid. They would kind of like stay at a certain level. They didn't get the opportunities because like, hey, what's wrong with that guy? Those types of things. So I've kind of taught myself, I guess, certain traits, and I've kind of worked through it. So I'd say it's one of those things where like professionally, I've definitely made myself a lot more extroverted, even so much the fact that like people around me will say, you're not an introvert. And I'm like, oh, I'm kind of wired that way, but kind of like, we all have our own thing. But then on the flip side, I also tell people, I'm like, look, and I've said this on the podcast before, every year I go on vacation by myself. So I'm married. I have 2 kids, teenagers, love my family, love traveling with them. But every September, I go to Disney World Universal Studios in Orlando by myself for a week.
I love that, Jeff.
It's amazing.
I love that.
So long story short, the way it started was back in 2012. I used to go to a sales meeting for the company I worked at. It was in Orlando in like September of 2012. And it was right around Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios Orlando. I'd never gone before, so I stayed an extra day, went to it. I was like, this is amazing. And at that point, my daughters were like 2 and 4 or 5 years old. Yeah. So going to Disney World with like a 2 and a 4-year-old, as you probably are aware, is a very different experience than going by yourself, right? Like they've got short little legs, you're walking around, you're doing certain rides, lots of bathrooms, stuff like that. So at this point in my life, this was 13 years ago, whatever. So I was probably early to mid 30s, give or take, or whatever. And I was just blown away by the experience. And I would go to the parks and not talk to a single person, and I was completely fine with that.
Yeah.
I did this for years through that sales conference. And once the sales meeting was over, I was like, you know what? I really enjoyed the experience, love it. And I just started doing it on my own dime, whatever, getting down there and whatever. My wife does the same thing too. So I think her and I were just destined to be together like this, because anybody else married, for the most part, if their spouse said, hey, I want to go on vacation by myself, would be like, are you trying to tell me something? Is there something wrong with me? But both of us were like, we need our family time, we need our us time, and our me time. Like we're both very much wired that way, that like, if Beth says to me, or I say to her, hey, I just need to take a walk by myself or go to the gym by myself or whatever, like it's not like, hey, what did I do wrong? Which is kind of like, hey, I need some me time. That's kind of how we kind of work, whatever.
I love that, Jeff. And I definitely have embraced me time more in the last couple of years and found how much I really enjoy it. Like really, really enjoy it, because it's like, it's calm. I'm not overstimulated. So for me, I think when I'm around people, it's exciting for me, but at the same time, it's very, very draining because I'm getting overstimulated. And it's just like, I would like go back to my room and like literally fall onto the bed after the sales meetings, because I was so tired.
I believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just on a side note also, and this is probably one of those silly comments out there as well, another good thing about me time and vacationing by yourself is you don't have to sell or explain or negotiate where you go for food.
Oh, yes.
So little things like, and again,
where do you feel like eating tonight?
Most married couples go through this, right? The one person in a couple is like, what do you want for dinner? I don't care anything.
I don't care.
Okay, how about this place? No, not that place.
I don't want that.
This place? Versus for me, if let's say I'm at Universal Studios and I'm like, hey, I want to have nachos for lunch 3 days in a row. That's cool. I do whatever I want. There's no, and again, Beth is super happy with whatever, and she's cool with everything. But like sometimes, especially with a family of 4, there's some negotiating that nobody has the energy for. So it's kind of, it is refreshing sometimes,
No, I agree. I have 3 kids. So I have 2 teenage daughters and 1 almost teenage son, and they're very different. All 3 of them are really, really different.
Right.
And so it's really difficult to find something, even like for dinner, that everybody can agree on. So very, very big feelings, very strong feelings about things. And it's all very, very different. So I think to your point, like that's also where I think for me, like just having a little bit of time to myself where I can just like watch whatever show I want to watch. I'm not negotiating any movies with anybody. Like it's really, really nice. And you know yourself the best. So like, if you really go through that, you kind of know what makes yourself happy. You can go buy yourself flowers. And it sounds cheesy as the Miley Cyrus song.
Oh, it's so true. Yeah.
It literally is as simple as like, I love flowers. So I'm just going to go buy myself flowers. Why am I not doing that today?
Absolutely. And who doesn't like ice cream for dinner, right? Something that, if I did it around the kids, I'd probably get some nonsense for. But like if I'm hungry and I'm like, hey, I just want a chocolate chip ice cream sandwich or whatever.
Yeah.
Just do it, right? Enjoy it.
Go for it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Same thing I'd say. And I know we have a couple minutes left, but last thing I would say also is like for me too, as I got older, I think I got more confidence in just doing, again, not just vacationing, but like as a wrestling fan, when I first started dating my wife and whatever else like that, she would go to concerts or wrestling events with me. But eventually I recognized that she just wasn't that interested. She was kind of doing it, on my behalf. So as I got older and going to wrestling events by myself, or I've gone to concerts by myself, it's kind of like when I was 18 or 19, probably wouldn't have done it. But like I'm, 20s and 30s, I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to let the lack of a partner or lack of somebody stop me from going, right? Because I'm looking at it and I'm like, if I'm at a wrestling show or like movies, here's a perfect example. So I go to the movies by myself all the time. And I have absolutely no problem with it because I look at it and I'm like, I have a very, I like horror movies, I like movies other people don't like, but also you don't talk during a movie usually, or you're not supposed to anyway. So it's a case of like, what experience am I actually missing by going there by myself versus, forcing someone else to go who's not going to enjoy it. So it's a case of, you know what, just be happy with it, just do it, enjoy it, and be me, right?
I love that, Jeff. I've gotten more comfortable with having meals by myself.
Yes.
I think part of that was from traveling maybe, but
Definitely.
I actually go, now I've got almost like a ritual where I go out to breakfast by myself. One day a week, I drop off my kids at school and I go and I sit at this table and I have my me time and my amazing breakfast that I love. And the me of 15 years ago would have been like, oh my God, you're sitting by yourself. Like people are going to judge you. And I'm like, no. And I know the waitress now. And it's a great experience, but I never would have done it 15 years ago. So I don't know that I've done a movie by myself. So I'm going to put that on my tickler list. And I'll give you the name of my restaurant in case you're down by Ocean City. You can come check out CJ's because it's really great breakfast.
I appreciate it. So shout out to CJ's down the shore. Awesome place, according to Tina. But yeah, so funny story about movies by myself. So the first movie I ever went to by myself was back in 2000, a movie starring Jason Biggs called Loser. So for me, I just thought that was ironic in the fact that I went to a movie by myself. It's called Loser. Something that 25 years later, the irony is still not short on me. So
that is hilarious, Joe.
It's just great. What I'll say, last thing too. So I know you mentioned that you go to breakfast by yourself once a week. Few things in life make me happier than going to a Mexican restaurant by myself and getting my own basket of chips and salsa. Just sitting there, not competing with anybody. Because the thing is, like, usually when I go with friends or family, I'll ask for multiple baskets because I love my chips and salsa. But like when I'm sitting there at the bar, chips and salsa, have a drink, have some nachos, have a taco, whatever else like that. Like, I'm not fighting for the chips. Like, they're all there. I'm not saying, are they going to take that chip or this chip? Like, they're my chips. Like, I can kind of do it and I can get more refills. If I have 4 baskets of chips, no one but the bartender is going to judge me. So I don't really care,
Exactly. You go for your 4 baskets of chips.
100%.
I'll go for my breakfast in the morning.
And, whatever makes us happy, right?
We'll both be happy and it's okay. Like I think a big piece of it, Jeff, honestly, and it's been a theme from, as we've been talking a lot, is this idea of like people pleasing versus like knowing yourself and having that joy in yourself.
Definitely.
And knowing that if you're happy, other people will be happy if you're happy versus the other way around.
I think so. I mean, I often make comments that like when I go on vacation by myself for a couple of days and I come back, like it's a hard reset for me. Like coming back, like I'm a happier person, I'm a better person. And that helps me to, again, as a recovering people pleaser, helps me, to make my wife and my kids happier because at the end of the day, you're only as good to other people as you are to yourself,
Exactly. Yeah. Awesome. No, I think that's great.
So Tina, we've discussed a lot. We've shared a lot. We might have shared too much. I'm not sure. We'll figure out at some point. We'll look at the ChatGPT on this to figure out if either of us are getting canceled. But with that said, before we do close, is there anything you want to support or you want to promote or whatever?
Yeah, so I have Project Badass that it's a weekly, almost like blog, I guess, that I do on LinkedIn. So I would encourage everybody to check out LinkedIn and you can see my stuff there. I do also have a couple of TikToks, but I will not be promoting my TikTok channels yet. At some point, I think I probably will, but I've just started dabbling in the last month or so in TikTok, and it's been a really interesting and fun experience.
Nice.
I highly recommend people check out TikTok because it's fun, but you've got a time limit on yourself.
So let me ask you this, and I know I'm talking, but we actually have unlimited time, but it is what it is. So for me, I would say for years, I did TikTok, and I just kind of watched videos. So a buddy of mine, like on a daily basis, would send me some dumb videos or whatever else like that. I'd watch it, whatever. I think one night I was drunk, or maybe worse, I'm not going to say what. And I was like, you know what? Let's open an account. Let's just do it and see what happens, right? So I opened an account. I was like, instead of watching it on the web, I was able to watch it in the app. And then I think, and I've publicly said here, so I'm at Seltzer 777 because Seltzer 77 was already taken, and so I had to take the 777. Mm-hmm. Posted a few videos, got maybe 100 or 200 views. And then about a year ago, I was at a wrestling show, posted like a 17-second clip and got 2.5 million views, which was just amazing. Like for me, I'm looking at it and I'm like, all my, I had maybe like 60 followers. I was like, nobody really cares. And then I posted one video, right place, right time, and I got like 2.5 million views. And since then I've got like 3,000 followers. So again, not fully, I'm not a social media influencer yet. Maybe one day.
That might be a micro influencer though. I'd say 3,000 gets you can be a TikTok shop affiliate with 1,000 followers, just so you know.
We could. I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, what's funny was once I hit 2.5 million views, all of a sudden TikTok gave me some more options, like allowed me to go live. It gave me some other options too, which I haven't really tried out too much. And what I'll say too is since that hit as high as it did, my other videos all of a sudden started kind of like creeping up a little bit too. So
interesting.
It was neat. TikTok, I'm still more of a watcher versus a poster. Like I think I started posting some reels or some short clips from this show over the last few weeks to kind of see how I can kind of expand my social media presence.
Yeah.
And especially since I use StreamYard for this podcast thing, it actually, the AI will create clips for me, which is pretty great.
Oh my gosh.
It's scary how well it works too. Like it'll clip 40 seconds. It has like a title, which I'm like, hey, it really transcribed it. It figured out the beginning and the end.
Generative AI, man.
It's amazing. I mean, I often joke Skynet's going to take over and we're all going to either be slaves to the robots or who knows what's going to happen. But
always say please and thank you when you work with ChatGPT.
I have
a very, very nice, polite, and respectful relationship with my large language models.
Oh, absolutely. With Siri, I've always been a big please and thank you, which everyone always mocked me for. But one day when they're taking over the planet and they're nice to me, we'll see what happens.
That Jeff guy, he was pretty nice. He was always nice to me. Yeah,
he was okay. Maybe they'll promote my
100%.
podcast. Who knows? So with that said, thank you, Tina, so much for joining. I want to remind everybody that obviously we do come here every week with a podcast. Everybody Has a Story with Jeff Seltzer. We'll be taking the month of April off as I'll be traveling the country. I'll be in Orlando. I'll be in Austin. I'll be in California. Lots of fun places. I won't have time to record, so maybe I'll pop a bonus up every once in a while. But after next week, probably won't be back until May. You can still follow the happenings of me and the show on Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod. My personal Instagram is at Seltzer77 for all things Jeff Seltzer, and also the official sponsor of the show is JeffSeltzer.com, brought to your buddies over at Daniel Ireland and Marcus Brandon. If you want to reach out to the show directly, if you want to send me a note, want to sponsor or whatever, email the show at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. Tell your friends, your family, your neighbors, whoever else like that. They can find the show on all podcast platforms. With that said, have an amazing week. We'll see if there's a bonus pod popping up. Maybe, maybe not. But otherwise, we'll have another one next Monday. Take care. Have an amazing day. Bye.